Didn't you love it when your kids were growing up, when you would tell them to do something and they'd obey you? Well, guess what? God loves it when we obey Him also. And if we want things to really work together for good in our life, we have to follow Him, we have to listen to Him, and we have to obey. I want to talk to you about obedience in your morning cup of inspiration. There's a couple stories in the Bible that really talk about how important it is to obey the Lord. One is in Jeremiah. And in Jeremiah chapter 38, King Zedekiah was going up against the Chaldeans, and God was telling him to go against them and to take them, but he was worried about some of his people that had already fallen to the Chaldeans. He was afraid they were going to turn him over, and Jeremiah was saying, don't be afraid. And in verse 20 of chapter 38, it says, but Jeremiah said, they shall not deliver thee. Obey, I beseech you, obey the voice of the Lord, which I speak unto thee. So it shall be well unto thee, and thy soul shall live. He was saying, if you listen to God, if he went up in power and took the Chaldeans, everything would be fine. A lot of times we tend to fear men instead of fearing God. When we fear God, which means not necessarily being afraid of God, but fearing Him, wanting to obey Him, wanting to do His will, then we don't have to fear men. And then in Acts, we read about the apostles. Boy, that is a great book that talks about how bold they were in growing the church and preaching the gospel after Jesus had ascended into heaven. And in chapter 5, we learn that they were arrested for preaching, but the angel of the Lord actually came by night and opened the prison doors, and they went out the next day and were preaching again. And then some of the people who had put them in jail heard about it, and they called them in and they said, what are you doing? We told you to stop preaching, and we're going to have to put you back in prison. But another man stood up for him and said, leave these men alone. He said, if what they're doing is of men, then their work will come to naught. But if it is of God, you can't overthrow it. And so in chapter 5, verse 29, Peter and the other apostles answered these officials who were going to arrest them again, and they said, we ought to obey God rather than men. They knew where their strength was, and they knew where their priorities were. So if God is speaking to you about something and you know it's Him, do it. Always obey. I've had times in my life where I felt He was giving me a little nudge to go speak to someone, and I didn't do it, and I always regretted it. So I've learned to obey the voice of the Lord. And I hope you do too. I'll see you soon for another Morning Cup of Inspiration.